Greetings, friends. Welcome to this live stream for Empty Cloud, New Jersey. So today we're going to speak about MN101, the Devadaha Sutta. Before we begin, let's pay homage to our teacher, the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammam sangham namasami. Yes, so today we're going to have a look at Majjhima Nikaya number 101. This is a very interesting sutta where the Buddha is speaking about another tradition that was very popular and an excellent spiritual tradition that was around at the time of the Buddha and even long before the time of the Buddha. And that is the Jain tradition. And as somebody said, hi, John. Hi, Rebecca also. Hi, Gregory, Madeline, Brian. Thanks for tuning in. As John says, it's difficult really to fault the practice of the Jains because they are, it's a remarkable tradition, a monastic tradition also. And it's really interesting that the Buddhist monastics and the Jain monastics would have been rubbing shoulders a lot at the time of the Buddha, particularly around Rajgaha, Bodh Gaya. Even today, when you go on maybe a Buddhist pilgrimage to Rajgir or Bodh Gaya, there are many Jain temples and shrines. And of course, there are still practicing Jains, both lay and monastic. And they have the different monastic orders. They have the naked ascetics and they have the white-robed ascetics. And it is a wonderful tradition. And it's very interesting how similar the practices and approaches and views are of path and of the cosmology also and of rebirth. There's so many connections between these two traditions, and yet the Buddha found fault with certain aspects of the Jain view of practice. And actually, in some ways, he comes across as being quite hard on the Jains, possibly because these traditions were in some way competing. They're both alms mendicant traditions, living in the same spaces. Perhaps a little hint of competition creeps in to the scriptures over time. But I'd like to really tease out the teachings that are relevant for us in this sutta, how we can benefit from the Dharma here. So let's begin. And I'm going to kind of go through in order, but I want to really emphasize the aspects that are helpful Dharma for us in our practice and just see other parts of the sutta. Let's see how we go. So yeah, hi. Yeah, Brian knows some Jains. Yes, absolutely. It is a great tradition. One of the renowned aspects of the Jain practice is the emphasis on harmlessness, isn't it, friends? That Jains are known for avoiding any kind of harm to any living creature. They take great care with their water, straining the water assiduously so that there's no possibility of ingesting tiny beings, to the level of insects at least. Bacteria, viruses, not much that can be done about that perhaps, but to remove any tiny mites and insects from the water. They'll wear a mask in order to avoid breathing in any insects inadvertently. And of course, they sweep the path in front of them as they walk so as to clear the way and gently move any living beings out of their path so they won't tread on them. And this is a significant difference also between the Buddhist view and the Jain view of karma, because according to the Buddha, karma is produced by intention. So we'd have to intend to hurt and harm in order for there to be a karmic result for us. Whereas for the Jains, even inadvertent harm and killing of small beings as we walk about and breathe in the air around us, this will be considered to be unwholesome karma for them. Hence this extremely careful practice of avoiding harm. And many of us will know Jains, will have seen Jains. Those who've practiced or traveled to India may have seen the naked ascetics. They generally congregate in large groups, practice in sanghas, and they'll have their bodies smeared with ashes, and walking around naked and living naked. Very difficult and quite the ascetic practice, isn't it, when you think about the ways in which our clothing doesn't just protect our modesty, but protects our bodies from so many beings coming and feasting on us, infesting us, and so forth. And not to mention the wind, the sun, the rain, the scorching heat in India in the hot season. So the naked ascetics are tolerating and working with all of these vicissitudes as a result of their practices. And not only do they go about naked, but they will practice all sorts of very painful austerities. The people, sadhus, that we might see squatting continuously, standing continuously, maybe raising an arm in the air and holding it there continuously, and so forth. Very painful, racking austerities. And this is part of the Jain way because of their view about karma, which we'll go into as we look at the sutta. So they are to be respected, to be highly regarded. The Jain monastics are certainly living a very intense, holy life and striving for liberation. And this is something really worthy of great respect. So we're going to just tease out in this sutta the differences in the approaches between Buddhism and Jainism, which both come from the same roots and have so much in common. So hi also to Haika, hello, Manal, Ujwal, and Jayantha. Glad you're with us for the live stream. So let's launch into the sutta, friends. Takes place at Devadaha. This is in the Sakyan country. So this is the Buddha's own territory from his time of birth. And it's a city, I think, or a town, Devadaha. It means the flame of the gods, or the devas, which is interesting considering that here we're having a conversation where the Buddha is speaking about the Jains who are practicing burning austerities, painful austerities. And this is not a direct conversation between the Buddha and any of the Jains. Rather, it's a conversation where the Buddha is addressing the monastics, Buddhist monastics. So here the Buddha is living at this town called Devadaha, and the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus thus. He says, there are some recluses and Brahmins, or some practitioners, who hold such a doctrine and view as this. And here we're going to hear the central tenet of the Jain tradition. Whatever this person feels, whether pleasure or pain, or neither pleasure nor pain, whatever is felt, all that is caused by what was done in the past. So by annihilating with asceticism past actions and doing no fresh actions, there will be no consequence in the future. This will lead to the destruction of action, of karma, of suffering, and a feeling, and thus all suffering is exhausted. So the belief is that everything that we have done comes to us and can be atoned for. We can do kind of penances through painful austerities to burn up and remove and reduce this unwholesome karma. Actually, the Jains consider karma to be almost like a physical essence that overshadows or corrupts or overlays our essential pure nature. They have the understanding that there is an immortal soul that is tainted by this almost physical overshadowing of karma. And when this karma can be removed through painful practices, through suffering here and now, then the clearing can happen and the immortal soul can be freed from the suffering. And there's also the sense of a beginningless and endless samsara in the Jain tradition, but there isn't a sense of wanting to strive to get free from samsara, rather to purify one's position, as it were, to purify the soul so that we can enjoy perpetual bliss and well-being. So this doctrine and view, whatever we feel, is all caused by past karma on our part, as it were. And in order to purify the heart, there has to be a practice of penance or atonement through suffering to purify the spirit, the soul. And so the Buddha explains this approach of the Jains. This is why they do the ascetic practices. And he says that he would speak to them. He calls them the Niganthas. The current teacher at the time of the Buddha, a little bit older than the Buddha, they had a very renowned teacher called Nigantha Nataputta, Nigantha the Nata's son. And this teacher was loved and followed by so many, lay and monastic. And in the Jain tradition, there are many what are called tirthankars, ford makers, bridge builders, those who help to rescue the souls of the followers. There are 24 tirthankars. So you can see so many similarities with Buddhism, where we have the various Buddhas from previous eons. And our current Buddha, Gautama the Buddha, so was born sometime a little bit after Nigantha Nataputta, the tirthankar of the Jains of that time. So the Jains at that time are called Niganthas, after their teacher. And so the Buddha said, I go to the Niganthas and I speak to them. And the Buddha asks these questions, or he asked these questions of the Niganthas. He asked them, do you know that you existed in the past? Do you know that you did evil actions in the past, made bad karma? Do you know what kind of bad karma you made in the past? Do you know how much suffering you've already exhausted? And do you know how much more suffering there is to be exhausted? Do you know where you're at, essentially, in this process of purification? And finally, the Buddha asks them, he said, do you know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is, and what the cultivation of wholesome states is? And to all of these questions, the Jains, in this sutta, the Buddha says they do not have the answers. So they don't know this teaching through experience. They take on the teaching because it's told to them by their teacher that there is this unwholesome karma that has to be burned up with austerities. They don't know how long the process might take. They don't know what the bad karma is, or even if they have this bad karma for sure. And also, we can glean here that the Jain practitioners are not focused on cultivating the good and renouncing the unwholesome. Rather, they're focusing on the austerities themselves, on the painful practices. And if you're feeling pain, then you're doing the right thing as a Jain. That's what really matters. I find this very interesting because we can, as Buddhist practitioners, also experience a lot of pain in our practice. And it can be helpful to recognize that we might fall into ideas about why that is. We can get into wondering about karma and how much bad karma has been made here. How much more suffering is there to endure? Where am I at? And probably most of us, if not all of us, don't know the answer to these questions. So we can feel very in tune, I would say, with these Naganthas who are unable to answer the Buddha's questions relating to karma. We just don't know. We're all in the dark. And not only were the Jains following their teacher through love and faith in their teacher, but also the Buddhists, we can say, until we're fully liberated, until we've really understood the way things are, we're also following our teacher and out of love and faith and trying to put these teachings into practice. But the Buddha was always encouraging his disciples to trust our own experience and not to take any of these teachings as true until we have put them to the test and found out for ourselves the benefit, the value. And this is a process for all of us, isn't it, friends? So I can feel a lot of connection with these Jains who are unable to answer the questions of the Buddha regarding the state of their hearts and minds and the path that they're on and where they're at on the path. The Buddha gives a simile here in relation to this question of how much we can know about our progress on the path. This is a simile of the arrow. It's another simile of the arrow. In this simile, the Buddha describes a person who's been struck by an arrow, a poisoned arrow. Great pain, great harm. And this person has friends and family who've managed to procure a surgeon to treat the wound, to pull out the arrow, to clear out the poison, to treat the wound and to treat the poison. And in the whole process of being cured and helped is also extremely painful and difficult. But the person bears with it and eventually gets to the point where the wound has healed over and the poison has left the body and the person can experience again well-being. And such a person, having gone through this trauma, this arrow injury and poisoning, can look back over all the events and recognize, yeah, there was the cause, the arrow that shot me and poisoned me. And then there was the treatment, and it was very painful, also very excruciating to go through the treatment. But there was a beginning to it, there was a middle to it, and then there was an end to it. I've come out the other end and I'm cured. The Buddha said, if you understood where you're at on the path, how much unwholesome karma is there, how much wholesome karma is there, how much the heart and mind have been freed from unwholesome past karma, and how much more work is yet to be done. If you knew all of this, you would be like that person shot by the arrow and then finally healed by the surgeon. But in fact, you're not like that because you don't know what the nature of the arrow is, and you don't know how bad the wound is. You don't know how the cure is going to go. You can practice to heal, but you don't know where you're at in this process. So the Buddha said in such a case, speaking to the Jains at such times, they would accept this teaching and appreciate and voice the fact that they don't know, they can't know how much unwholesome karma they have and how much pain, how many austerities are required in order for them to purify their souls, to come out of suffering altogether. The Buddha said, then they would tell me, the Niganthas told me, well, we have faith in our teacher. He is, Nigantha Nataputta claimed to be omniscient, all-seeing, all-knowing. He is all-seeing and all-knowing, and he's told us that you have unwholesome karma, and it will require these austerities, painful tortures of the body as your practice in order to clear. And when you clear it, then you will end up being healed and you'll be free from suffering. And this is the process that you have to go through. And the Jains said to the Buddha on occasion, well, we are satisfied with this teaching. We're happy to follow it. We trust the words of our teacher. And again, friends, I think we can reflect as Buddhists that we also put faith in the words of our teacher. We trust what the Buddha is telling us. We don't necessarily know for sure, but we put our hearts and minds and our energy and effort into the practice with confidence over time in these teachings. So again, there's a great similarity between these Jain disciples and perhaps the disciples of the Buddha who are listening to him on this occasion at Devadaha. The Buddha said, I would then tell these disciples of Nigantha Nataputta, I told them there are 5 things that may turn out in 2 different ways here and now. Those 5 things are faith, approval, oral tradition, reasoned cogitation, and reflective acceptance of the view. We see these 5 in other suttas also. These are 5 ways, friends, in which we may come in contact with spiritual teaching, spiritual guidance. We may come in contact with teachings in such a way that we study them, the texts, the oral tradition. We may investigate them intellectually, the reasoned cogitation. We may contemplate what we've been told, come to a reflective acceptance of the view. In these ways, we can investigate spiritual teachings. We may also have faith. We may find a teacher, love that teacher, trust that teacher, look up to them, and for that reason, follow the path that they're on. And also there may be approval. There may be a sense of, you hear some teachings and there's a feeling of affinity or recognition. Yes, this rings true. And that intuitive sense of acceptance can encourage us to follow those teachings. So these are the 5: faith, a kind of affinity with the teachings, study of the teachings, intellectual understanding and contemplation, experiential understanding of the teachings. And as the Buddha says here, those approaches, those experiences may turn out in one of 2 ways. Either the teachings are going to be true or they're going to be false and leading you astray. And in every case, we have to be open to this possibility. The Jains, the Buddha's inviting the Jains here to open to the possibility that their teachings may not be all helpful and all true. And in the same way, the Buddha encourages us in other suttas to scrutinize the teachings, scrutinize the Dhamma that he's teaching in exactly the same way, to investigate if we're following through faith or through intuition or through intellect, through practice or through reasoning, through reading, studying the suttas, in every case, we want to be open to the possibility that these teachings may not be correct, this practice may not be right. We need to keep a skeptical mind and test them out and slowly come perhaps to a sense of confidence, but not to take any of the teachings at face value. So this teaching is for all of us. In this case, the Buddha encourages the Jains to consider thus. He then goes on to say to the Jains, according to the Buddha, he would speak to them about cause and effect, to point out to them. So when you're practicing austerities, what is the cause of the pain that you're feeling? When you really investigate, can you say that it's due to past unwholesome karma? Do you know that? Already we've come to understand that we can't be sure of that. We don't really know what our past karma is. And so the Buddha says, consider what is the cause of your painful feelings. Is the cause of your painful feelings the fact that you're inflicting pain on yourself in your austerities, in your painful practices, here and now? So there's cause and effect. You inflict harm on yourself, you starve yourself, you expose yourself to the hot sun in the middle of the day or to the cold in the middle of the night. You take up postures that are painful for prolonged periods of time. What is the cause of the pain that you're feeling? It is, of course, that action in the present moment. And the Jain disciples could accept that this would be surely, truly a way to understand the cause of pain. It's what is being done now. It's what is being experienced now. Whatever the past, we know this much. And it's also true for us, friends. And we can consider, when we have painful feelings, what does the mind do? How does the mind proliferate around that? Do we not often fall into the trap of magical thinking, making up stories about why I'm feeling pain, considering all the possible causes, all the things I might have done? The reason this is coming to me now, there must be a reason. I have to know what it is. And the mind will prevaricate and proliferate endlessly around our experience in order to avoid simply being present for the suffering that is unfolding. And we can all recognize then that there is this tendency that we all have to distract ourselves with all sorts of ideas relating to past and future around what's actually happening now. So this teaching is relevant for all of us, and an encouragement for us to notice when we are losing ourselves in delusion. Any ideas that we might have about the way things are inevitably going to be wrong. The truth is always other than that. We can't think our way into wisdom, into understanding. It's not possible. It dawns through experience and letting go of our ideas, letting go of our views of karma, of past, of future. So the Buddha's pointing this out to the Nigantha Nataputta's disciples here. He goes on to ask them more questions. The Buddha said he would ask them these questions also. I would ask them, is it possible through exertion and striving that you can alter an action, karma, result of vipaka, a result of karma that is due to manifest now? Can you change it and push it into the future? Or can you bring some future fruit of karma and make it manifest for you now? Can you take an experience that is pleasant due to some wholesome karma in the past, perhaps, and turn it around and make it painful? Or can you do the opposite? Turn a painful result into a pleasant one? Can you take a experience that is intense and strong and make it slight, gentle, insignificant? Or a very mild experience, can you turn it up and make it stronger for yourselves? Can you take an experience that you're having now of pleasure or pain, or neither, pleasure nor pain, and can you turn it off, just will it away? Or can you create a pleasant, painful, or neutral feeling out of sheer willpower, volition? In all these questions, the Buddha was asking the Jains, how much control do you think you have over your experience? How much can we know and how much can we manipulate our experience? And of course, the answer to all of these questions is we can't choose what we feel in relation to this and that. We can't manipulate karma. We can only experience what arises. And so there is an invitation here for the Jains in this case to recognize that we can't make our karma different through doing this practice or that practice. We don't have that kind of control. We don't have that agency. The only agency we have is to open ourselves to experience now and to develop a right relationship with that. And so the Jain practice of austerities, in order to, in a way, manipulate and do away with past karma through an act of will, essentially, through willful practices, is not the way forward. And the Buddha is pointing to this. And so in all these different ways, we can appreciate that this view of painful practices leading to the end of suffering is one that can be investigated and kind of analyzed in such a way that it doesn't really hold up. It doesn't really serve. And it's very interesting. Let's remember that the Buddha himself, as the Bodhisattva, spent 6 years practicing painful austerities in really extreme ways. Maybe part of the reason that he's quite fierce with the Niganthas is because he was perhaps practicing with them for all that time. He was maybe following them for some or all of that time. He certainly adopted those very same practices, and he was practicing in that way for a considerable time, longer than he practiced with his teachers who taught him the Arupa jhanas, his first teachers, when he started to live the wandering life and was seeking guidance, seeking direction. First, he learned the Arupa jhanas, states of great bliss and well-being, and then he started to take up these ascetic practices, as so many people in that time and place were doing, including the Jains. So the Buddha really speaks from experience. I feel he came to a realization himself, didn't he, friends, that they were not working. The ascetic practices were not leading to the end of suffering, and he gave them up. And then he began to practice through looking after his body, practicing meditation, the middle way. And so we find these two traditions living side by side, so similar in so many ways. And yet the Buddha had this breakthrough that led him to step aside from this way of practice. And he gives here all the reasons why It's good for us also to do the same and to clarify around our experience of pain and pleasure, not to create stories, not to feel that we can manipulate and control our experience in these ways, not to strive to put ourselves in painful positions, to do painful practices, thinking that this is somehow going to purify the heart more quickly for us. So the Buddha goes on to really kind of censure the Niganthas. He gives 10 grounds for legitimately censuring their approach. So again, this is quite tough as a way of speaking about fellow venerables, fellow practitioners. But he says there are these 10 legitimate deductions that provide ground for censuring these views and practices. He says, if pleasure and pain are caused by what was done in the past, then we can only assume that those who are doing these painful penances must have done bad deeds in the past. If pleasure and pain are caused by a supreme God, then one can only assume that those practicing austerities and inflicting suffering on themselves must have been created by an evil God. Or if pleasure and pain are caused by chance, circumstance, then such people must have very bad luck. If pleasure and pain are caused by one's birth or one's class, then they must have a very bad class, a very unfortunate birth. And if pleasure and pain are caused by exertion here and now, then they are striving badly here and now because they're just producing more suffering for themselves. So the Buddha said in these 5 ways, such practices of austerities are to be censured, and in another 5 ways too, because in each of these cases, if it's true or not, if the cause of suffering is any of those 5 things, that is what was done in the past, that is past karma, God, chance, exertion here and now, or the birth that we've taken, any of those causes, if they're not true, also one is to be censured for creating suffering here and now. So in these 10 ways, the Buddha censured the Niganthas for the practice of austerities. And again, I feel it's like the Buddha's own journey and own turning away from the austerities, from the painful practices that is informing this teaching for us. And now, friends, I want to come to the core teaching because this is the way the Buddha moves forward in his conversation with the Jains to point to the Dhamma. And he says, how then is exertion fruitful? How is striving of great fruit? How do we strive? If not to practice austerities, then how to practice? And he said to them, one should be ideally not overwhelmed with suffering in the here and now. If one is relatively free from suffering, or there's a balance of pleasure and pain in our experience, then we can work with pleasure through striving to let go, and we can work with painful experiences through the development of equanimity. One not overwhelmed with suffering does not overwhelm oneself with suffering and does not give up the pleasure that accords with Dhamma. There's nothing to be afraid of in the pleasure that we can experience through our practice, through the letting go, through the development of samadhi, through the peaceful, equanimous development of the heart over time. This is a pleasure that we do not have to be afraid of. But We do not want to be infatuated with that pleasure. So how to relate to pleasure and pain? The Buddha's telling us here. We can strive with determination to let go of painful and pleasant feeling, and we can develop equanimity towards the experience of pleasant and painful. So in short, it's the mindfulness, the reflecting upon our experience, the development of non-reactivity, opening us up to wisdom, to insight. In short, following the Eightfold Path is the way to work with our experience. The Buddha goes on in this sutta to outline the entire path of practice that he taught. So here he's saying to the Jains, strive with determination and develop equanimity. Don't create new unpleasant feelings for yourselves. Just be present for what is naturally unfolding. He gives the example of how to work with pleasant feelings. He gives a simile, which is a very one that we can probably all resonate with, friends. And this is the simile of the person who's infatuated, who's fallen in love. And he says, imagine a person's fallen in love with another, and they are enamored of that person, infatuated with that person, and they see that person with someone else, laughing, chatting, and having a wonderful time. How would that person feel? And one could say it, maybe one might feel jealousy, feel disquiet, feel upset, and unhappy to see our beloved with someone else having a wonderful time. Maybe not, but certainly it's very relatable, isn't it, that one might feel actually quite distressed by that. And so such a person, the Buddha said, may reflect, I'm suffering a lot when I see my beloved with another person, having a wonderful time. Why don't I let go of this infatuation, of this being enamored and ensnared and caught up with the doings of this other person? And so such a person strives and makes great effort and mindfully considers the pain and suffering that are there and lets go and puts aside this infatuation. The Buddha was explaining that this is a way in which we can work through striving with pleasant feeling, pleasant, painful feeling. The Buddha said also, there are sometimes good reasons to practice austerities, not in the way of thinking that through the practice of experiencing painful states, I'm going to manipulate and control and get rid of past karma, but rather, if we should notice that when I practice austerities, wholesome states increase in me and unwholesome states diminish. So through wise attention, if we notice that our practice benefits from renunciation, from a certain degree of austerity, doing without certain things, putting ourselves in uncomfortable situations, if we find that this actually increases the wholesome and diminishes the unwholesome, then this is a time that we may practice austerities. The Buddha gives a simile here of another arrow simile. This is the simile of the arrowsmith. He said, imagine a person, an arrowsmith is making an arrow, and in order to straighten the shaft of the arrow, they put the metal into a furnace between two flames, and they're beating it and straightening it out. It's painful, it's hot work, and there's a lot of noise and clamour in the straightening of the arrow. But once the arrow is straightened, the shaft is straight, then the arrowsmith can douse the flame and the arrow can cool and be left aside. The work is done. And he said, in the same way, we can cultivate austerities, uncomfortable practices, even painful practices, if we wisely discern that this is a good time for us to straighten up, to let go of certain things, to move away from certain things, to develop certain qualities, such as patience, forbearance, right effort. So there's a time, but we need to discern when that time is for us to take up austerities. And when the work has been done, we can know equally when to put those austerities aside. It makes me think of young monastics. When we ordain at a young age, there's often a lot of energy. There can be a lot of sexual energy, a lot of passion in the heart, heat in this way. And it can be very difficult to work with this, as in the example of the infatuated person, the simile before. It can be very difficult just to be with strong passions and drives. But if one takes up some austerities at such times, cold showers, getting up early, sitters practice, not lying down to sleep, long hours of practice, walking and sitting meditation, such practices can really help to move through the attachments, the heat of emotion, of passion, of sexual desire. And so for younger monastics, often it's very helpful to practice in a more austere way that may be very uncomfortable for the body, but the body can take it. There's enough good health, resilience, and so these practices can be taken up, and then to know when to put them aside. When is there a time to relax and to come back to taking care of the body and allowing a more peaceful approach. And this is for each of us to discern. So here the Buddha is explaining, how it is we can make use of the austerities, the Dhutanga practices for the monastics. Have a number of austere practices that we can take up that are allowable for us. We're not allowed to do things like intentionally hurt and harm the body or take all our clothes off. We're not allowed to be naked ascetics. We have to cover up for modesty's sake and to protect the body from the elements and from other creatures. We're not allowed to take up postures that are painful and prolong them. None of that's allowable, but we can just eat one meal a day. We can just sleep under a tree at night. We can just wear the triple robe and not have any extra bits of clothing to keep us warm, and so forth. There are certain austerities that are allowable for the Buddhist monastics and that can be used for liberation when we wisely discern that they may be beneficial at some points. So this simile of the arrowsmith is so helpful. And then the Buddha goes on. He said, when I speak to the Jains, to the Niganthas, then I explain to them in this way how it is that I came to be the Buddha, how it is that I understood the way out of suffering as it really is, and that this is the practice of the middle way, avoiding the extremes of too much indulgence or too much austerity, and with wisdom to chart our course, practicing the middle way, practicing the Eightfold Path, developing mindfulness, sati sampajanya. And so the Buddha goes through the whole path of practice: sense restraint, moderation in eating, moderation in sleeping, developing the mind through meditation practice, and developing right view. Most importantly, he then pointed out that he would teach the Four Noble Truths, the cause of suffering, that there is suffering, but there is a cause. We cannot discern precisely and exactly where the suffering has come from, but we can say that it is due to one thing, and that is desire. That is wanting. wanting and not wanting. And so there can be a cessation of that suffering through the letting go of wanting and not wanting. And in order to develop this ability to let go, we can practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And so here we can see the fullness of the Buddha's teaching in this sutta. And we can compare and contrast with the practices of the Jains. We can see, with great respect, how very similar the monastic lives are. Actually, the Jain monastics practice in a much more ascetic way, much more of the austerities, even to this day. And so they may often regard the Buddhist monastics as rather soft, rather indulgent, not really practicing seriously. And we can understand this from their perspective, just as in the same way, the Buddha's 5 companions, when he was practicing the austerities, and then he decided he realized this was not the way forward, and started to feed himself, look after his body again, how they viewed him until he became the Buddha, and they could see that something wonderful had taken place, and this was a person to listen to and to follow again. But until that time, they also looked at him with a rather jaundiced eye, as someone who'd gone soft. So when we consider the practice of the Jain monastics, even to this day, we can have great respect and consideration for their efforts, and really just to acknowledge the similarities then, and also the differences in our view. And those differences in view make all the difference. Let's use these teachings and glean the understanding of what is the Buddha Dhamma here, and test it out, each one of us for ourselves, to find whether it is true or not, whether it is valuable or not for us. So we have a few minutes, friends. I'm going to go through the chat, and if I can, and just see if there's any questions or comments or reflections, which are so welcome at this point. So hi again, everyone. Thank you for your presence. I hope it is a tough sutta, John, this one. It is difficult to fault the Jains, absolutely. So I hope that this conversation is helpful. And also, friends, of course, this is merely a commentary on this great sutta. Have a look at the sutta, read it through, and see what comes to you, because there's so much in this sutta, actually, to investigate and to tease out the meaning. And also we can consider, what it is that the Jains are practicing, and what is the history of that tradition. Yeah, Brian says, I know some Jains and they're wonderful people with a worldview that is largely aligned. Absolutely. It's so aligned. One of the things that Buddhists are most well known for, in fact, in my experience, is that we are harmless. We are devoted to harmlessness. And this we have in common with the Jains. As I said, the Jains practice harmlessness to a much greater degree. Great care, great patience and consideration in their every move to avoid hurting and harming any living being. It's very beautiful to behold. But also Buddhists, we have this central tenet to do no harm, avoid harm, do good, and of course, purify the mind, purify the heart. But first, we avoid harm. Hello, also Ujwal and Japalsin. Hi, Maria, Bhumika, Japalsin. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Jain is still being taught here. Absolutely, there are many Jains in the world. I guess, I don't know for sure, but I imagine probably a majority in India. I met many Jains when I was in Mumbai. I was studying at the university there, and there are many Jains at the university, and they're very generally academic, business people, because there are many professions that they cannot partake of. They'd never be in farming. That's impossible for them because of the ploughing of the earth that's required. Not fishing, not the meat industry. Of course, they wouldn't be involved in any harmful industries or businesses, but they are generally very successful and affluent business people. There's a huge Jain community in Mumbai and many other parts of India. I know very little about the Jains, I must say. John. Okay, I've got a couple of comments. I'm going to not read through, but just bring them up because they're a little bit longer comments. Thanks, Heike. Thank you. Oh, that's lovely. You're enjoying the teachings. Thank you, Heike. And Rebecca says, the idea of painful practice to obtain desired results has seeped into spiritual practice from both Eastern and Christian traditions. It is so helpful that the Buddha is so clear on this. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Rebecca. And in fact, personally, I can say I found it very helpful. At one point in my practice, I'm sure I'm not sure, but I may have had some Jain influences in the past in some way, because I had this idea, actually, that sitting through pain was somehow really helpful. And I think it was partly because when we sit through pain in our meditation practice, when we eventually get up and move around and the pain is gone, we feel so much better. There's such a relief from the pain that we can feel very buoyed up by that, almost a bit euphoric. And this can lend itself to views and opinions around the benefit of having sat through so much pain. I was a little bit inclined to the view that it was good to suffer in meditation practice. I didn't inflict suffering on myself, but just sitting. If any of us sit for a long time in one position, we're going to eventually feel pain. And I was into sitting for long periods of time. And I came to recognize through reading this sutta, a penny dropped at that point, and I realized, oh, I'm leaning in that direction for sure. And I think a lot of practitioners can lean in that direction and also can have many, many ideas about what's unfolding. The simple experience can be, endless creation can happen as a result of simple experience. This ability we have to, it's maniati in Pali, to imagine, to proliferate, to create endless stories around our suffering and also around our pleasant experiences. And we can just really note this, that we're all in the same boat, whether we're Jain or Buddhist. We're all going to have this, in a way, challenge at times, to be able to let go of the ideas that we might have. How do we come to right view and keep honing our view, purifying our view? We can be sure that whatever we think right now about the practice is likely to require further refinement through experience. Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca. And Madeline, need to think about this sutta a little more. Yes. The Buddha made further points about karma. He did. There are 2 suttas in Majjhima Nikaya specifically on the topic of karma. And what I might do, I'm not able to give a Dhamma session next week, but maybe the following week, so in 2 weeks' time, I will speak about those 2 suttas, and let's expound, let's explore, let's investigate some more the teachings of the Buddha on karma. Thank you, Madeline. And final comment before we close from Brian. Thanks, Brian, who says, I attended a day-long retreat on the weekend in which a teacher, Plum Village lineage, discussed how true concentration requires a light touch, that it should be like tasting ice cream. That's really delightful. Yeah, that, the degree of striving, again, this is a huge topic, but look at the Niganthas, at least at the time of the Buddha there, striving and struggling, as he did himself as the Bodhisattva, to produce all sorts of painful feelings in the body. And, you could imagine gritting your teeth and pouring with sweat and making enormous efforts to hold the painful postures and so forth. And also, we can all be subject to this kind of unskillful striving in different ways. When we meditate, sometimes we might notice ourselves gritting our teeth and clenching our jaw, and our foreheads might be all lined and eyes screwed up because we're making an effort to be present. We're making an effort to relax, and we can be very awake to this and just notice if there's any tension coming in, if there's any stress coming in, because we are so conditioned to be stressed and to be tense. Of course, when we develop our meditation practice, we can notice that these states are there for us. And so our job is to be aware of the striving, the degree of effort, the effort that's being made, how it's being made. And when there's too much of a push, too much focus, too much effort being made to hold still and steady, then to relax. Remember the taste of ice cream and chill. Thank you, Brian. It's, again, a huge topic, the topic of right effort. And it's like the tuning of the violin, to get just the right note, not too sharp, not too flat, not too much, not too little in the way of effort. And this is another aspect of our practice that's really something to focus on. And it promotes mindfulness when we consider effort and energy. It really brings up mindfulness for us. So thank you for bringing that in. I hope you had a wonderful retreat there. Sounds like it was good. Yeah. Thank you, friends, so much for your kind attention. And I'll see you in 2 weeks' time, hopefully. And meantime, all good wishes for your practice. Now, let's finish with 3 heartfelt sadhus, respecting and honoring our teacher, the Buddha. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.